The night the Carolina Star drifted through the bronze-colored storm, the crew believed they had crossed into some place God never intended men to see. The ocean churned like molten metal, shimmering with unnatural light that glowed from somewhere beneath the waves. Silent lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating shapes that should not have existed. Jagged rooftops, archways, broken towers lying just below the surface as if an entire coastline had drowned centuries before. Captain Henry Slate stood on the deck, gripping the railing, unable to explain the phenomenon. Sailors whispered that they heard voices calling their names from below the surface, gentle, rhythmic, almost like chanting. 3 men jumped overboard before the others could restrain them. When the storm finally released them 2 days later, the mast was cracked and the crew refused to speak of what they had seen. Nearly a century later, when the sealed logs of the Carolina Star were discovered in a forgotten naval chest, historians dismissed the accounts as hallucinations until they saw the map tucked inside. It depicted an unknown stretch of coastline labeled simply as the Invisible Coast Empire, 1541. The cartography was precise, depicting harbors, mountains, and river systems that matched no existing American terrain. And in the bottom corner, written in disciplined handwriting, was the name Elias Rowan Carter, a government surveyor long believed dead. Carter's journals were found separately, hidden behind the walls of an abandoned barn in rural Georgia. They were water-stained and half-eaten by insects, but the words were still legible. His first entry began with the certainty and dread of a man who had seen something vast enough to fracture his understanding of the young nation he served. He wrote that he had been sent by the U.S. government to map the southern frontier and investigate unusual trade goods turning up in Savannah. Coins of bronze carved with unknown symbols, fabrics dyed in colors that had no natural explanation, and tools forged from a pale metal that seemed both lighter and stronger than iron. Carter quickly realized the items came from a civilization that was not supposed to exist. His journey began in Savannah, where a warehouse full of confiscated smuggler goods contained artifacts that baffled every expert. Among them was a scroll written in a script that resembled a mixture of Creek syllabary and something far older. The symbols were too elegant, too purposeful to be mere decorations. When Carter unrolled the scroll, he found not religious text, but what appeared to be a maritime record. Tides, latitudes, coastal warnings, along a coastline America did not recognize. He cross-referenced it with the strange map from the naval chest, and the lines matched perfectly. He traveled south with Creek guides who agreed to accompany him only as far as a place they called the Hushed Belt. They refused to enter, claiming it was a forbidden region guarded by spirits older than the tribes themselves. Carter assumed this was superstition until he reached the border and saw a straight line of trees stretching endlessly in both directions. They had grown so perfectly aligned that they formed a natural wall, too uniform to have formed by chance. The bark of the nearest tree bore a symbol he had seen before, a spiral sun with 4 extended arms. Carter stepped beyond the tree line alone. The forest grew unnaturally dim, the air colder than the season allowed. Paths narrowed, sunlight faded, and the wildlife's presence vanished entirely. Then the trees thinned and the world ahead brightened so abruptly that he shielded his eyes. When they adjusted, he saw what he later described as a city that should not have existed, but stood defiantly against every law of history. White crushed shell roads glistened under the sunlight, forming pathways that led to structures built from black timber, polished to a shine, and stone quarried from pale cliffs. Irrigation canals cut the land with geometric precision. The entire place seemed engineered with a mastery that surpassed any of the frontier settlements. The people walking those streets wore layered sea-green fabrics, copper-banded jewelry, and sandals decorated with shells that chimed softly as they walked. Their eyes were calm, observant, not startled in the slightest by the sight of an outsider. It was as though they had been expecting him. A tall man stepped forward from an archway and greeted him in unaccented English, saying he was late, that their empire had expected the Americans generations earlier. Carter, stunned, asked what empire he had entered. The man answered, "You stand in the eastern province of the invisible coast. Our lands stretch farther than your maps allow, and our history runs deeper than your nation's first breath." Carter walked the city, guided by men and women who spoke fluent English, yet dressed in a style he had never seen. They explained that their ancestors had fled a cataclysmic flood centuries before Europeans arrived, and had settled along a hidden coastline shaped by unpredictable tides. The empire grew in isolation, guided by a council of scholar rulers who believed secrecy was their only protection from foreign conquest. They built their cities behind what they called the Veil of Trees, a living barrier engineered through agricultural knowledge far surpassing anything Carter had encountered. What shocked him most was how deeply the empire understood the United States. They had studied American politics, tracked frontier expansion, and even forged discreet alliances with runaways, enslaved men and women who had reached their hidden cities seeking refuge. The invisible coast shelters offered freedom, protection, and citizenship, all granted by the empire in exchange for secrecy. In return, these people brought knowledge of colonial developments and military strategies. The invisible coast saw America growing rapidly, stretching westward, hungry for land and power. They recognized the pattern because they had seen it before, in the conquistadors who once tried to reach their hidden shores. Carter learned that in 1541, a Spanish expedition discovered the empire's eastern harbors, but never survived long enough to report the finding. The empire dismantled the intrusion with methods Carter would later describe in terrified awe. Methods involving sound-based weapons, traps engineered into the coastline itself, and naval tactics that made entire fleets disappear without a trace. Carter's astonishment grew as he listened to their history. The Invisible Coast Empire never conquered outsiders. They neutralized threats quietly, surgically, leaving no trace. Their philosophy rested on a single belief: survival was safer in invisibility than in dominance. But the empire had begun to fracture internally. Factions disagreed about remaining hidden as America expanded. Some believed the United States would eventually discover them and attempt to seize their lands. Others insisted that revealing themselves would bring catastrophic conflict, but hiding forever was unsustainable. Carter realized too late that his arrival was not an accident, but a sign of desperation. The empire wanted to understand whether the United States could be trusted, or whether war would be inevitable. They questioned him about American politics, military growth, the Louisiana Territory, and the intentions of President Jefferson. They seemed particularly concerned about the American hunger for coastlines, ports, and naval dominance. Within days, Carter sensed that something immense was unfolding, something bound to reshape America's future. And the empire's rulers, known as the Mariners' Council, were debating whether to let him leave alive. They feared what knowledge he might carry back, yet they also saw him as a potential intermediary between two worlds that had been separated for centuries. But something else was happening beneath the empire's surface. Strange tremors shook the coastline. Giant waves broke against unseen barriers offshore. Lights flickered under the ocean at night, just like the sailors of the Carolina Star had described decades before. The empire scholars whispered of an ancient event returning, a rising of the lost coastline their ancestors had fled, a reshaping of the seafloor that threatened every harbor and city they had ever built. Carter soon understood that the empire was not simply an isolated civilization. It was a civilization living on borrowed time, trapped between a changing ocean and a rising American power. And he, an ordinary surveyor, had walked into the heart of a crisis neither nation was prepared to face. Carter did not sleep the first night within the empire. The room they gave him was comfortable, walls made from a black wood polished smooth enough to reflect firelight, a bed woven from something softer than cotton, and lanterns filled with a translucent oil that burned with a steady blue flame. But his mind refused rest. Every sound outside, soft chimes from the sandals of patrolling guards, distant murmurs of water flowing through engineered canals, metallic drumming echoing from workshops, reminded him he was living in a nation his own country did.
The wind carried a strange vibration as they moved deeper. No longer just rustling leaves, but something rhythmic, almost like a distant pulse pushing through the earth itself. Elias slowed his horse, listening. Rutledge noticed. "You hear it too," the captain muttered. "Thought it was just my nerves." "It's coming from ahead," Elias said. "Not natural. Too steady." They continued until the forest opened into a wide, bowl-shaped valley carpeted in gold-green grasses. The sound grew stronger, clearer, like hundreds of wooden rods striking in synchronized patterns. At first, Elias thought he was looking at windmills, but these structures were taller, thinner, built from layered timber and anchored by stone bases carved with symbols he did not recognize. Dozens of them rotated in slow mechanical precision, powered not by wind, but by weighted counterbalances and flowing water channeled from the creek. "Machines," Elias whispered. "Not tribal, not colonial. Something else entirely." Rutledge scratched his beard. "This valley ain't on any damn map." The valley stretched nearly 10 miles, surrounded by ridges that formed a perfect natural ring, an unintentional fortress. But what drew Elias's eye were the settlements beyond the machines. Rows of longhouses built with precision, straight roads of packed earth, fenced orchards heavy with fruit, and fields arranged in almost geometrical patterns. People moved in the distance, organized, purposeful, unpanicked, not startled by outsiders, not hiding. A society, structured, confident, and very real. This is a civilization," Elias whispered. "An entire one." Before Rutledge could reply, a horn sounded from one of the ridges, not shrill, calm, signaling. The valley's workers paused, turned, and watched the two foreigners who had appeared at their boundary. Within minutes, 6 riders approached, mounted on tall, powerful horses unlike any the Americans had seen. Broad-chested, long legs, light step, trained for speed and maneuver. Their riders wore layered cloth armor reinforced with hardened leather plates, decorated with insignias that resembled intertwined branches. The leader dismounted with an ease that spoke of discipline and authority. He was in his 40s, sharp-eyed, gray beginning to touch the edges of his dark hair. When he spoke, his accent surprised Elias. It was unmistakably shaped by English, but older, as though untouched by the last century of colonial influence. "You stand at the boundary of Arbor lands," the man said calmly. "Declare your intent." Elias exchanged a quick look with Rutledge before responding. "We are explorers, representatives of the United States. We come in peace." The man studied them, not intimidated, not impressed, simply measuring. Explorers find many things in these lands, but arbor has not been found in over 100 years, not by accident. Elias's pulse quickened. Rutledge shifted uneasily. "You hear of the United States?" Elias asked. A faint smile touched the man's lips. "We know of every nation that has risen on this continent, but few know of us." The riders formed a semicircle, not aggressive, but deliberate. The leader continued, "You will come with us. The council will decide whether your presence is trouble or inevitable." And with that, they were escorted into the valley. As Elias entered, he felt a strange certainty settle in his chest. Not fear, not excitement, but the dawning realization that he had stepped into a story the world had somehow forgotten to tell. The valley grew more astonishing the further they went. Water channels fed fields with engineered precision. Children practiced coordinated drills in open courtyards. Craftsmen shaping metal in ways Elias had never seen, folding, fusing, sculpting alloy with remarkable skill. Even the air carried a sense of order, as though every structure and system had been refined through generations without turmoil. "Rutledge," Elias whispered, "what if this place predates us, all of us?" Rutledge didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the towering structure at the valley's center, 5 stories of stone and timber spiraling upward like a giant tree trunk, carved with reliefs depicting hundreds of years of lineage. Their escort dismounted. "Welcome," he said. "You stand before the Loom Spire, the heart of the Republic of Arbor." Elias felt his breath catch. A hidden republic, a functioning nation, in the center of a continent everyone thought was unmapped? The leader motioned toward the entrance. "The council awaits." And as Elias stepped inside, he knew his mission for Washington had just transformed from a mapping expedition into something far greater. The discovery of a civilization whose existence could alter the fate of the United States or threaten it. He would soon learn the truth. Arbor had stayed hidden for a reason powerful enough that some believed no outsider could be allowed to leave alive. Inside the Loom Spire, the air shifted, cooler, denser, infused with a faint aroma of pressed herbs and aged timber. It felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into a preserved memory. The walls curved upward in a slow spiral, carved with scenes of people, forests, battles, treaties, migrations, an entire civilization's history engraved in flowing, interwoven lines. Elias felt the building itself was telling a story. Rutledge leaned in. "These carvings, they're old, older than anything I've seen west of the colonies." "They're records," Elias whispered. "Histories." Their escort led them toward a circular hall lit by shafts of sunlight captured by angled mirrors. 12 figures sat around a stone table arranged in a perfect ring. They ranged from young to elderly, men and women dressed in layered cloth armor or woven robes. Each wore a band on their left forearm, silver, copper, gold, perhaps indicating rank or role. As Elias and Rutledge entered, conversation hushed. The leader who had escorted them spoke first. "Honored Council, these men were found at the northern boundary. They claim to be diplomats of a new republic to the east, the United States." The murmurs that followed were not surprised. They were analytical. An elderly woman seated at the far end spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried the authority of someone used to command. "The United States," she repeated. "A nation birthed by rebellion. A union forged recently, yet ambitious. Your eyes were anticipated, though perhaps not so soon." Elias cleared his throat. "We didn't know your republic existed. Our maps. Your maps were drawn by those who never saw beyond their frontiers. Arbor has remained unseen for 2 centuries, not by accident, by necessity." "Then allow us to understand. We seek no conflict, only knowledge," the elder murmured. "A word that has started wars." She motioned to a younger counselor, a woman with long dark braids tied in a knot. "Bring the records." She disappeared into an alcove and returned with a flat wooden case. When she opened it, Elias saw not parchment, but thin, flexible sheets of treated plant fiber, marked with symbols and early pictographs. She laid one sheet on the table. "This," the elder said, "is the story of why Arbor hid from the world." She gestured for Elias to approach. As he did, he saw the drawings, a great migration across the Appalachian Mountains, settlements built in forested valleys, a meeting between early Arbor founders and European explorers, and then a symbol Elias